Extracted from the diary of an army surgeon, Hobart Town, 6th of August, 1839. I have come to the conclusion today that the strange behaviour of Major Molineux has something in it which is quite beyond ordinary eccentricity. I think that I have found in him a case worth studying. When I arrived here 10 weeks ago from Calcutta, I was insufferably bored with the place, and cursed Groscott for inducing me to visit it. An officer of irregular horse may find some enjoyment in playing billiards at the Ship, or in drinking brandy and water at the barracks. But for a man of 40 compelled to take compulsory leave of a profession in which he delights, Hobart Town possesses few charms. When I prescribed a dose of quietness and pure air for myself, I did not intend to live utterly without intellectual society. But the old Major has given me something to think about. Let me first describe him. He is a tall, thin, muscular man, of commanding presence and military bearing. He has white hair, a white moustache, and a very red face. He is always tightly buttoned and braced. He carries a thick stick and wears buff gloves, a common sort of fashion enough for retired officers. But with all this there is something more. His blue eyes are always withdrawing themselves from you to furtively glance behind you. I have turned round a dozen times when playing whist with him to see if anybody was overlooking my hand. His large, long, white fingers are perpetually twitching and working, and he has a habit of drawing one hand through the other, as though to disencumber himself of a glove. His voice is singularly low and soft for so large a man. You expect from his manner of walking and sitting that he will presently roar out at you, but he speaks in a singularly apologetic sort of way, in an undertone, and without any assertion of authority. The most curious idiosyncrasy of Major Molineux, however, is this. He ceases to be on each Thursday in the week. A constant visitor to the Union Club, I have observed that the Major never makes his appearance on that day. Suggesting to McBride, manager of the Derwent Bank, that perhaps the old gentleman was unwell, I was told that he never appears on Thursdays. Debating with Johnston, of the First, if it would be well to ride over and visit the invalid, I was told that the Major never receives visitors on Thursdays. And being anxious to send a small cheque for a night's losings at whist on Wednesday, I was told by the postmaster that I might as well wait until Friday, as no letters were taken in at Castle Stuart on Thursday morning. Castle Stuart is a huge, colonial-built, red brick house on the road to New Norfolk. It is sunk in a spacious bush park, not unadorned with shrubs and trees planted at some expense. The stables are unusually large, and the outhouses almost like barracks. In former days the Major kept a large household, but since the sudden death of an orphan niece, to whom he was much attached, he has persistently refused to entertain company, and contented himself with the humblest retinue. An old man and a woman still older who acts as cook are with their master the sole inmates of Castle Stuart. It can readily be understood that this condition of affair has given rise to some comment. Hobart Town is not a large place, and as the society consists almost entirely of military officers and the civil service, the strange conduct of the Major has been food for scandal during many a day. He, however, appears to busy himself but little with the conjectures concerning him. He rides into town twice a week for his rubber of whist, and apart from his day of seclusion, comports himself like every other half-pay officer in similar circumstances. Baggerly, the man, and Mary Pennythorn, the maid, are deaf to all hints and persuasions. Indeed, the old woman is almost imbecile, and the man, a queer wizened old rascal, a manumitted convict, who walks lame and has a trick of talking to himself, professes to know nothing whatever concerning his master's eccentricity. Now, there is nothing very remarkable in an old bachelor who has lost the only person for whom he may be presumed to care, keeping a sparse table and living an inexpensive life. But this weekly seclusion is a puzzle to the whole community. No one seems to think that the Major has had any event of importance happen to him on a Thursday, nor that it is necessary or proper for him to shut out, at that particular time, the world and its surroundings. The death of Miss Tremaine occurred on a Monday, and moreover it was noticed, so they tell me, that the Major had begun to avoid society on Thursdays before that sad event took place. The first time that this remarkable dislike to be seen abroad on the 5th day of the week openly manifested itself was, I am informed, at the club, at a levee given by Governor Arthur on the occasion of his arrival. Everybody in the city who had any pretensions to social rank attended as a matter of course, and no military or naval officer could have absented himself without causing the gravest scandal. Major Molineux attended, but his behaviour was said to be most extraordinary. His carriage drove up to Government House with the blinds closely drawn. After some seconds, the door was opened, and the Major, dressed in full uniform and leaning on the arm of Miss Tremaine, appeared. His face was, in strong contrast to its customary hue, of a death-like paleness, and a clammy perspiration beaded his brow. On stepping out into the light, he placed his hand before his eyes, as though to shade them from the sun, and then drew himself up with an effort, as though nerving himself for some dreadful task. He pressed his niece's hand with the air of one who might take an eternal farewell, and then tottered, rather than walked, through the corridor. He passed through the special door set apart for those having official cards of entry, and making his way straight for the dais, attempted to tender his respects to the representative of his sovereign. His Excellency, who had heard of Major Molineux's services, would have detained him with some words of kindly recognition. But at the moment he stretched out his hand, the Major paused, and fixing his eyes on the group behind the Governor, seemed as though about to utter some startling announcement. His mouth remained open, but no sound issued from it, while the convulsive working of his features betrayed some powerful emotion. One of Colonel Arthur's staff stepped forward and took the unfortunate gentleman by the arm. The contact seemed to recall him to himself, and stammering some incoherent excuse, he allowed himself to be led to his carriage, where his niece waited for him in an evident condition of anxiety. The next morning he called on the Governor and explained that a sudden indisposition, for which he could not account, had prostrated for the moment his physical powers. His excuses were, of course, accepted, with many expressions of regret for his illness. But since that day, he has never quitted his house on a Thursday. Some months afterwards, Miss Tremaine died, and the Major then dismissed his servants and commenced to lead the solitary and strange existence in which I found him. Chapter 1. I have just read the above, which was written nearly 40 years ago, when I was on a visit to Hobart Town to recruit my health, which a long residence in India with the regiment to which I had been attached as surgeon had considerably impaired. For reasons which will in the course of this narrative be apparent to the reader, I found it inconvenient to continue any daily record of one of the most remarkable cases which ever came under my experience. Indeed, it became, as will be seen, advisable that there should be no written statement extant of Major Molineux's misfortune. And for half a lifetime, I have put away my knowledge of the facts as one puts away some family secret. But the sight of the faded ink of my diary, and the certainty that, ere long, I shall be incapable of narrating the occurrences which influenced the whole of my subsequent career in life, have induced me to briefly state as much as I may, of one of the saddest and most terrible histories ever confided to a professional ear. Julius Fair, M.D., late Surgeon Major. Apart from the peculiarity which I have recorded in my diary, no man could be more courteous than Major Molineux, and few more entertaining. He did not ask me to Castle Stuart, it is true, but he was good enough to devote many mornings to making me acquainted with the beauties of the country more immediately surrounding Hobart Town, and entertained me by many amusing anecdotes of early colonial days. He too had been in India in early manhood, and we passed many a pleasant hour in comparing notes as to our travels and experiences in that wonderful country. Entering the army at an age when most men are fagging in the cricket field or spelling out their daily modicum of Horace, Major Molineux had seen much service in many countries. His genial manner, soft voice, and dignified bearing added much to the charm of his narratives. Though for the most part self-educated, as must necessarily be the case when a man enters early on the business of life, he had accumulated more than considerable information on many topics not generally touched upon save by very active minds. In addition to his fund of anecdote and his acquaintance with what may not inaptly be called the personal history of our more celebrated military campaigns, he was a naturalist of no mean attainments, an accomplished taxidermist, well read in the literature of natural science, and possessed of by no means a contemptible knowledge of physiology. I was agreeably surprised one day, shortly after our first acquaintance, to find that his response to some casual remark of mine upon an experiment recorded in a medical journal which I had received from England betrayed an acquaintance with the subject which would have been notable even in a professional man, but which, coming from a layman, was quite remarkable. "Yes," said he, in reply to my query, "I take a great interest in matters of that nature, a very great interest." He seemed about to say more, but turned the conversation abruptly, nor could he be afterwards brought to resume the discussion. One other subject was, as a matter of course, taboo between us, the existence of such a day of the week as Thursday. I once purposely mentioned the day, affecting not to be aware of his antipathy to it, but the result forbade me to repeat the experiment. Major Molineux became visibly disturbed. The colour left his face, and he trembled violently. His appearance, in fact, was that of a man who had just received some nervous shock, or who had unexpectedly swallowed some nauseous and poisonous substance. He recovered himself with difficulty and took occasion to make a hasty departure. He did not wholly resume his friendly relations with me for some days, being apparently fearful lest by inadvertence I should again offend, and though my curiosity was piqued almost beyond endurance, I took care not to risk the loss of so polished an acquaintance by impertinent intrusion into that which, after all, was no business of mine. The time passed pleasantly. Our bi-weekly rubbers and our almost daily conversations continued to our common content. My leave had nearly expired, and I had already begun to make preparations for carrying my reinvigorated liver back to the land of heptalgia, when one of those accidents which are the providences of romance occurred. The next neighbour of Major Molineux was a gentleman named Rochford. He too had been in the King's service, and like my friend had sold out in order to settle down upon the fine estate which he had acquired under the operation of the colonial land laws. Captain Rochford, for he assumed brevet rank on the sale of his lieutenant's commission, owned a somewhat similar house to that of Major Molineux, for all the houses in that colonial day were built on the same plan and after the same pattern. But the cheerful residence of Captain Rochford was in marked contrast to the gloomy mansion and overgrown garden of the owner of Castle Stuart. Not only were the grounds of Ashmead Park kept in the completest horticultural condition, but the house was enlivened by a constant gaiety in which the good magistrate's charming daughter took a conspicuous part. Miss Beatrice Rochford was, when I first knew her, a beautiful young girl of 16, having at once that exquisite complexion and that nobly rounded figure, the possession of which makes the native born of the most delightful of the Australasian colonies a sort of commingling of Devonshire loveliness of face with Spanish splendour of form. She was the only child, and both her father and her mother spoiled her. Allowed to have her own way in everything, she would have grown up without culture and almost without education, had it not been for the more than sisterly friendship displayed by Miss Tremaine. While Miss Tremaine lived, she exercised over the excitable and impetuous nature of Beatrice an influence greater than that of any other person. From all that I could gather, Agnes Tremaine had been a girl of rare promise. Miss Rochford told me that all she knew of music, and she played brilliantly, had been taught her by her dead friend, and her mother confidentially informed me that had it not been for the Major's niece insisting that Beatrice should share her studies, the watercolour drawings which decorated the breakfast room at Ashmead would never have been executed. One day Miss Rochford showed me a portrait of Agnes Tremaine. It was a miniature, very beautifully painted on ivory by the celebrated Wainwright, and represented a fair girl with lofty forehead and large grey eyes. A refined and delicate face, was my comment, as I handed back the picture. And a good face, said the impetuous Beatrice, kissing the miniature. No one knows what she endured in that dreadful house. You rouse my curiosity, I said. What is this mystery concerning Major Molineux? I don't know, said Miss Rochford. I think poor Agnes knew, and the knowledge killed her. You are aware that they say the house is haunted? They say that of all houses which are shut up. Pray, what shape does the familiar spirit take? You laugh, of course, Dr. Fair, but nevertheless there is something horrible to me about Castle Stuart. The closed windows, the desolate garden, that horrible old cripple, and Mary Pennythorn with her toothless mouth. Ugh, the thought of it makes me shudder. But my dear young lady, there is nothing horrible in lameness. And though the absence of teeth may render Miss Pennythorn unsightly, the poor woman is to be pitied rather than shuddered at. Of course, but I cannot help shuddering at ugly things. Even the Major, for all his soft voice and smooth ways, is sometimes repulsive to me. I think of him shut up in that lonely place every Thursday in the week, and wonder what horrible act of wickedness he is committing, or what dreadful penance he is inflicting on himself for some past crime. You've never been to the house, then? Never, since poor Agnes's death. Nor would I go, even if I was asked. I rode up once to escape a thunderstorm, and went round to the back of the stables. They were empty, the windows of the rooms were boarded up, and not a creature was about the place, not even a dog. When I turned the corner, I could see the room which had once been Agnes's bedroom. The curtains had been taken down, and the window was wide open, like a great blankly staring eye. It was horrible, and I turned Sultan round and never drew rein until I was at our own park gates. But this is mere fancy, Miss Rochford. There is no reason to suppose that Major Molineux is anything but the best and kindest of men. I felt nearly as much interest as you do in the matter, and all my inquiries but serve to show me that your father's old friend is most honourably esteemed. Then why does he shut himself up for 24 hours every week? Persisted the laughing beauty with that carelessness as to the motives of others, and that inability to understand the unconventional, which is peculiar to the young and happy. I should dearly like to discover his secret. Would not you, Dr. Fair? I confess that I should be glad if he would reveal it to me, I replied, for as you say, it is a most puzzling business. Then we will penetrate the mystery together, said she, flashing a dazzling smile on me from between her red lips. Here is my hand upon it. But ere I could imprison the tiny fingers, she was gone. I did not dream how sadly and how soon her jest would be realized. Chapter 2. I have said that Miss Rochford was allowed to have her own way by her parents. She did in fact as she pleased, stayed at home to paint and read for the best part of 1 week, and during the next would close the piano, put away her unfinished watercolours, fling her books into a corner, and go scampering over the country upon her Arab horse, Sultan. I've heard my Indian friends say that if an Arab horse is not docile, he is more difficult to manage than any other. Sultan was certainly a proof, in some sort, of the truth of this statement. He was awkward in the stable, and even his own groom was not without some little dread of him. When mounted by a stranger, he seemed to lose all control over himself. And though Beatrice Rochford was absolutely without fear, and rejoiced in sitting her plunging and rearing steed, her father was always threatening to exchange the beautiful but unruly creature for a more placid, if less showy animal. But the wilful girl pouted and coaxed by turns, until the good captain pressed his grizzled moustache upon her smooth young brow, and withdrew his determination for that time. He had indeed a well-merited admiration for his daughter's skill as a horsewoman, and during some of our many pleasant riding parties, I have often reined my steed alongside his more mettlesome hunter, to watch Beatrice, as, sitting well back in the saddle with her hands low on her horse's wither, her veil blown like a streamer from her hat, and her dainty figure swaying like a willow to every bound of the snorting horse, she allowed the delighted beast to take his own course through bush and brake, until, with heightened colour and ringing laugh, she flung him on his haunches, not 5 lengths from where we stood. She was a featherweight, and her hand was as light as gossamer. But Sultan had been perfectly bitted, and dropped his head to the curb like a colt. So long as his temper was not crossed, he was perfection. "You shall never sell him, Papa," the lovely girl would cry after one of these daring flights, and the noble horse arched his muscular neck to the caress of the stroking whip-handle, as though to ask pardon for his occasional outbreaks of ill humour. One day we were returning from a long ride to New Norfolk, a charming village situated on the banks of the Derwent, which in some places assumes the aspect of an English trout stream. The day had been chilly, for we were approaching winter, and fires had already made their appearance in the hospitable rooms of Ashmead. The road lay by the side of the stream, which brawled and foamed some distance below us over its rocky boulders, and the unwonted coldness of the air, together with the peculiar aspect of the swiftly flowing brook, brought distant England vividly to my thoughts. "How like this is to a scene in one of the mountain countries of England, Rochford," I said. "It is," he returned. "I wonder if either of us will see them again." The question was a pertinent one, and I fell into a reverie of recollection, in which all but the existence of home and friends was for the moment forgotten. I was aroused by an exclamation from Captain Rochford, and raising my head became conscious that Beatrice was no longer with us. My companion's horse fretted under the restraint of the bridle, and I guessed that, finding us both wrapped in thought, she had, with her customary impulsiveness, galloped off down the rocky road alone. "Let us push on," I said. "It is getting dark. We shall overtake her soon." "It's not that," said Rochford. "Look there." And he pointed to a turn of the road, which, visible to us on account of our elevated position, could not be seen by anyone in the gap through which Beatrice was evidently riding. A bullock team, attached to a wagon loaded with timber, apparently cut from the land of Major Molineux, had camped in the track. The driver was asleep by the side of the road, and the animals had taken advantage of the absence of his formidable whip to snatch a few moments' respite from their toil. There were 8 in all, and they were disposed right across the road, one of the polers and the 2 leading bullocks lying down. Rochford shouted at the full strength of his voice, but the man did not stir. He was evidently drunk. I could distinguish, or thought I could distinguish, the rapid rising of Sultan's hoofs in the pass, as he was being urged at the top of his speed to the collision which awaited him. I too called out, but the word that rose to my lips was "Beatrice!" I knew in that moment that the liking I, the middle-aged army surgeon, had for this beautiful and wayward girl, who was almost young enough to be my daughter, was a feeling warmer than mere friendship. Breathless, we awaited that which we knew must come. It was useless, worse than useless, to follow down the gap. We should only encourage the horse to greater speed, and should see nothing of the catastrophe. It came at last. Round the rock at full speed wheeled the flying horse, and simultaneously his rider saw the danger. There was but one chance, and that was balked. Just as she reined Sultan for the desperate leap, the drunken tried to rise. A less uncertain-tempered horse might even then have escaped. But the Arab saw the uncouth figure with the hated whip, swerved, fell on the great horns, recovered himself with a scream of pain, and rolled backwards over his rider 20 feet sheer into the river. How we reached the spot I never knew. There are some actions which under great excitement one performs automatically. I was told afterwards that I had fastened my bridle swiftly to a branch, and leaping down from crag to crag had gained a jutting point below the spot where the unhappy girl had fallen, had plunged into the stream and dragging her from the dead horse, had drawn her to the bank. I only remember standing in my wet clothes beside her, watching some faint colour of life gradually creep back to her white lips, while her father, like a man beside himself, galloped off to Castle Stuart for assistance. When he returned with old Baggerly, I had regained my composure. Nothing steadies the nerves of a surgeon, if he loves his profession, like an immediate necessity for the display of his utmost skill. Beatrice was cold and almost pulseless. Her left arm was broken, and when I raised the eyelids from the once lovely eyes, nothing remained of those large and liquid pupils but two scarcely perceptible specks. "I have bad news for you," I said. "I cannot, of course, speak definitely yet as to the full extent of her injuries, but Miss Rochford has broken her arm and has received severe concussion of the brain." "I will borrow Molineux's carriage," said Rochford. "No," said I, "I'm not prepared to risk the journey. Miss Rochford must be taken to the house at once." The lame servitor looked askance, but Captain Rochford made light of all objections. "Molyneux would never be so absurdly fanatical as to refuse us his hospitality in such an emergency," he said. "I will answer for him." So making a litter with saplings and blankets brought from the house, we carried the still unconscious girl through the open door, and placed her in a room to which Mrs. Pennethorne directed us. I set the broken arm at once, and apprehended no danger on that score. But on examination, I found a comminuted fracture of the skull, with displacement of the external table, and dreaded the result upon so highly sensitive and delicate an organisation as that possessed by my patient. It was clear that she must remain where she was for some days, perhaps for weeks, and I recommended my friend to continue his journey home with all speed, and send out Mrs. Rochford to act as nurse. "I will remain here until you return. And indeed, if Major Molineux will permit it," I added, "I will stop for the next 24 hours, at all events." Rochford departed, and in obedience to my summons, Mrs. Pennethorne appeared. She was a pale woman, with a strangely frightened air, and furtive, light blue eyes. The misfortune of which poor Beatrice Rochford had spoken was very apparent, and certainly very repulsive. "Let me have candles and a fire," I said to her. "I must stop here tonight. When do you expect Major Molineux home?" "He is at home now, sir," replied the old woman in a low voice, which her imperfect articulation rendered almost unintelligible. "But he cannot see anyone." For the first time I remembered that it was Thursday evening. Chapter 3. A bright fire, and homely but plentiful preparations for supper, exercised on me their cheering influence, and I succeeded in shaking off a certain depression of spirits which had seized me so soon as the imperative necessity for attending to my patient left me leisure for reflection. The old housekeeper had, according to my directions, contrived accommodation for Mrs. Rochford in the same room with her daughter, while I was given a bedroom in the next corridor. Supper was served in a spacious apartment downstairs, which seemed to be used by the master of the house as dining room and library combined. A portrait of the deceased Miss Tremaine, painted by the same hand which had executed the miniature in the possession of Beatrice Rochford, on the wall over the chimney, and beneath it was placed the Major's dress sword and some withered branches of cypress. A heavy writing table of solid fashioning occupied the embrasure of one of the windows, and lying upon it were some 3 or 4 volumes, evidently freshly imported from London. A new book has always an irresistible attraction for me, and moreover on this occasion, I was anxious to see what sort of literature my eccentric friend affected. Judge of my surprise to find that 3 of the works treated of the higher mathematics, and the 4th was the last speculation of a physician whose name had a European fame upon insanity. Taking up the lamp, I examined the shelves. I expected to find there works which a military man of culture would naturally purchase, and I was not mistaken. The Life of Sir David Baird, Orme's Hindostan and Southey's Peninsular War, Elbo Dubosc's History of the Prince Eugene, and Mackenzie's Tipu Sultan, while Churchill and Harris's Voyages sat pleasantly alongside Barclay's Universal Traveller and the early volumes of the Dispatches of the Duke of Wellington. Oliver's Entomology and Lebelardier's Plants of New Holland, together with some fragments of Bewick, filled in the spaces between Shaw's lectures on zoology, while Audubon's Birds of America, with some few volumes of fiction, enlivened the higher shelves. The best of the collection, however, was almost entirely composed of treatises on mathematics and the latest works on mental disease. Not only were Bayle, Boyle, and Laplace in their due place of honour, but the Norwegian Abel sat up beside them, and the latest volume of the Philosophical Transactions had between its leaves a paper covered with calculations made in dispute of Hopkins's statements anent lunisolar precession and nutation. A row of folios in sheepskin bore the honoured names of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. The best editions of Harvey, Bichat, and Fothergill lay with the last numbers of the medical and surgical transactions near them, while I could see that the Swiss edition of Tissot bristled with page markers. But on the table were piled books which seemed strangely out of place in the house of a military officer, however cultured. Bohave de Goster, Didier, Cabinets, and Schenck are not authors which one would expect to meet out of the library of a physician, nor are the Opuscula of Van Helmont, Les Sciences de l'Homme of Bartlet's, or Leersatzer of Prochaska, works with which a retired major of the line would be likely to soothe his leisure hours. I was interrupted at once in my researches and in my reflections by the arrival of the carriage containing Captain Rochford and his wife. As may be readily imagined, the poor mother was in a condition of great anxiety. Nor was her trouble much alleviated by a visit to the sick room. Miss Rochford was still unconscious, and though by the application of wet cloths to the head I was enabled to keep the inflammation in check, I could as yet offer no decided opinion as to the result of the case. It might, indeed, be even yet necessary to use the trephine, but I did not desire to alarm either of the parents, and I made the best assurances I could of their daughter's ultimate recovery. One thing, I said, is absolutely necessary: perfect quiet. If you move Miss Rochford from this house until I am fully satisfied that she can bear the journey, I will not be responsible for the consequences. Tomorrow we will, if you choose, call in the family doctor. Tonight the case is under my care. Captain Rochford was good enough to express his perfect confidence in my skill, and took leave of us in terms which seemed to indicate that his mind was at ease. I pressed him to stop, but he declined. I learn from the old man Bagley, he said, that Major Molineux has been informed of our presence in the house, and that nothing but the extreme urgency of the case induces him to allow us to remain. I'll come back again in the morning. Although I defended our involuntary host from the grave charge of discourtesy, I felt that perhaps it was well to intrude upon his strangely enforced privacy as little as possible. Having paid a last visit to my patient and given directions for my immediate recall in case of need, I returned to the dining room, determined to enjoy myself for a few hours by browsing among the scientific pasturage so curiously and so liberally provided. I found it impossible to fix my attention on the page. Speculations which, at another time, would have enchained me, vaguely glimmered into my consciousness and disappeared again before I could grasp them. insignificant and forgotten events of my past life suddenly sprang into my memory with startling distinctness, and an apparent importance wholly disproportioned to their value as factors in the sum of my existence. I recalled faces of my boyhood, and seemed to hear voices long ago silent, whispering about me. The wind had risen with the moon, and the night foreboded tempest. The rushing of the swollen stream mingled with the lashing of the rain, as it beat faster and faster upon the panes, while the distant flapping of some unhinged shutter gave querulous and doleful token of the desolation which reigned around the mysterious and ill-omened house. I more than half repented that I had insisted upon the establishment of Miss Rochford in a place so dismal and so fraught with gloomy recollections. But her removal would have been attended with graver danger, and my better sense informed me that my fears were merely fancies engendered by shaken nerves and mental strain. Resolving to get the poor girl into the more cheerful society of her own domestic circle without delay, I adjusted another log on the fire, and endeavoured to rally my faculties into some more pleasant mood. Alas, I but succeeded in making myself more uneasy than before. The chink of the falling embers sounded like low, warning cries. The roar of the river became a threatening voice. The scream of the blast was like the last appeal of some wildly parting soul. The indistinctly heard rustling of the trees seemed to urge flight. Through this medley of sounds and sensations, the intermittent flap of the loose shutter recurred at irregular intervals, like the sound made by one who, with failing strength and yet passionate persistence, would gain shelter from some pursuing terror. I felt horribly alone. From above me looked down the sad, wild eyes of the dead girl, and about me were only the tokens of the strange, perhaps hideous speculations of the mysterious recluse. At that moment, I heard a stealthy footfall in the passage. Without pausing to think, I flung wide the door and confronted the intruder. At first, I felt inclined to burst into laughter. Old Baggerly was creeping towards the staircase with a tray, upon which was spread meat and wine. "Bringing me something to eat," I said, ashamed of my abrupt outbursting from the door, and yet glad of this momentary companionship with humanity. "It is for the Major, sir," said he, endeavouring to pass, and seeming unaccountably agitated. "But the Major doesn't want 2 forks and 2 knives, and all that meat," said I. "Perhaps someone sups with him." "What is that to you?" said the old man, with a sudden savage snarl, making as though, having both hands engaged, he would have bit me sideways in his wolf-like fury. "You've had all you want. If not, I'll bring you more. Leave us alone. We have our own ways." And vouchsafing no further parley, he climbed the stairs which led to his master's apartments. More puzzled than ever, I returned to the gloomy dining-room. Had I stumbled into a house of madmen? Was the unreasoning terror of the toothless beldam but a form of idiocy? Was the old convict, with his ape-like skull and his canine rabidity, a maniac? And the master of this desolated and death-haunted ruin, who shut himself up for one day in the week, and enshrouded that day with such precautions against being taken unawares, that his very food must be conveyed to him at night and by stealth. What was he? Was he, too, insane? Had he brooded upon madness until he had become mad himself? Was he doing penance, as Beatrice had suggested, for some frightful crime? Did those doors, behind which he lived his forlorn life, conceal some poor relative whose sad calamity was held a misfortune to be bolted in and barred away from men? Or, most horrible thought of all, did he keep concealed above and watched by the crazy pair some poor wretch upon whose dazed brain and diseased body he might practice devilish experimental arts, if haply he might work out one or other of the wild theories propounded in some of the more speculative of his philosophers? Even as the thought shaped itself, there rang through the house a series of piercing shrieks. Chapter 4. In another instant I was at the head of the stairs, but paused in my onward flight, for the sounds issued from the room occupied by Beatrice and her mother. Mrs. Rochford was lying on the floor, senseless. Ringing the bell furiously, I raised her to her bed, and with the assistance of the old woman, whom the cries of the unhappy lady not less than my importunate summons had brought to the spot, I succeeded in restoring her to consciousness. Her first words were, "Is it gone?" "What?" I asked. "The white face at the window," said Mrs. Rochford. "That imploring, maddened face." "What can she mean?" I asked Mary Pennethorne, but the old woman, moping and mowing, made no reply. "See, madam," I said, flinging wide the lattice, "the storm has passed, and with it the cause of your alarm. Some leafy branchlet carried by the wind, perhaps even some more wrathful gust than usual, has, while rousing you from sleep, given form to a passing dream. Look, the sky is almost cloudless." And in truth, the tempest had, during the time we had been occupying ourselves with the frightened woman, quite passed away. The scene was one of exquisite peacefulness. The clouds had almost withdrawn, and the wet trees sparkled in the beams of a glorious moon, which rode high in a serene heaven. All felt the influence of the scene. Beatrice, sunk in her stupor, alone was ignorant alike of sounds and sights, but her mother composed herself with a smile at her former fears, and as I sought my comfortable couch, I felt that science and sentiment alike bid me laugh at the ungrateful fancies which an atmosphere surcharged with electricity could breed in a brain usually so cool as mine. The excitement of the day caused me to sleep longer than my wont, and it was nearly 8 o'clock when I awoke. I discovered, by the hot water jug, with its carefully placed towel, that the rude valetage of Baggerly had already been exercised in my chamber. And before I had completed my toilette, the old servant introduced himself with the compliments of his master, and information that breakfast would be ready for us in half an hour. Captain Rochford had already arrived, and with him I visited the sick room. Beatrice was still insensible, but Mrs. Rochford was up and dressed. Rochford laughed at her story of the ghost, and gathering courage from my assurance that the patient was progressing favourably, we went down to breakfast in something like good spirits. Major Molineux received us with more than courtesy. He lamented the accident, but trusted that the skill of a surgeon so well known as myself, and the careful attention of a mother so devoted as Mrs. Rochford, would soon restore his fair guest to her wonted health. "I'm afraid," he said, as he assisted us to the dish before him, "that my poor house is but a gloomy place for a convalescent, and I trust that Miss Rochford's convalescence may be early. Such as are the resources of the place, however, command them. I regret that I was unable to render you any personal assistance yesterday, but I must compensate for my enforced neglect by devoting myself to all your services during the next few days." The language was of the politest, but there was no mistaking its meaning. Rochford and I looked at each other. It was quite evident that Major Molineux did not desire that we should pass another Thursday under his roof. "I trust that Miss Rochford may be able to travel to her own home before this day week," said I, somewhat pointedly. "In the meantime, let me thank you for the courtesy with which we were received, and especially for the hospitality of last night." The hand with which the Major was lifting the teacup to his lips trembled slightly, but he said merely, "It was a wild night, a night of storms. I trust you were not disturbed." "I was most terribly disturbed," said Mrs. Rochford. "I think I have said that she was not a woman of much force of character or quickness of apprehension. I had the most shocking dreams, a white face at the window." "Nonsense, Mary," interrupted Rochford. "You were nervous." "There is no one in the house but myself and the two servants," said the Major, who had completely regained his composure, "and I am sure neither of them would have the temerity to disturb your slumbers. Pray," he added, turning in stiff condescension to old Baggerly, "have you been amusing yourself by terrifying my guests?" The old man seemed dumb-stricken. He tried to speak, but words failed him. Lifting up his hands with a gesture of terror, he made for the door, and turning as he went, displayed again that wolf-like savagery of aspect, the which I had observed on the previous night. "A curious fellow," said Major Molineux, cracking the shell of his egg. "But faithful. An old convict, of course. I have touched some tender chord, perhaps." Perhaps he had, for Dame Pennethorne waited upon us during the rest of the meal, and even brought the Major his cigar case when we found ourselves in the dilapidated but spacious veranda, prepared to seek the solace, which in those days was supposed to lie in Manila tobacco. The conversation, of course, was of the accident and its results. The prospect of the patient's recovery, the punishment to be meted out to the self-indulgent bullock driver, the quality of Sultan's temper, and the equestrian skill of Miss Rochford were all debated in turn. A learned discussion was held upon fracture of the skull, and I was compelled to illustrate as best as I might the operation of the trephine. At last, exhausted with surgery, and convinced that he was thoroughly competent to treat a similar case, should he ever meet with one, Rochford betook himself to visit the scene of the accident, and left me alone with our host. Major Molineux seemed uneasy. He got up and paced the broken tiles of the piazza floor, talked of 20 things in a breath, and flung away his half-consumed cigar, only to light another an instant after. "You are restless this morning," I said, willing to gain, if I could, some information concerning the mysterious seclusion of yesterday. "Did you not sleep well?" "Oh yes," returned the Major indifferently. "I slept well enough." And then he fixed his eyes on the wall behind me, with that strange stare of which I have already spoken, and wiped from his brow some large beads of sweat which had suddenly appeared there. "I seldom sleep very soundly." "Indigestion, I suspect," I continued in a careless tone. "A man who eats enough for 2 people at about midnight can scarcely wonder if he suffers from nightmare." With a visible effort, my interlocutor withdrew his gaze from space, and looked me in the eyes. "Then you saw Baggerly with the tray," said he. "I am ashamed of my voracious appetite," he added, with an attempt at a smile, "and try to laugh myself out of my gluttony by demonstrating to my actual vision that I do, in fact, partake of a double portion of food. Your notion is ingenious, but I fear that you will never effect a cure by its means. Let me feel your pulse." He gave me his wrist. The hand was hot and dry, the pulse full and bounding. "I will write you a little prescription which may do you good. Give me a sheet of paper." And I led the way to the library. "There," said I, folding the sheet. "Though I saw Woodville and Sowerby on your shelves, I doubt if you are fully acquainted with the virtues of the lily tribe." "You have been among my books, then?" said the Major, looking round. "I have, and am surprised to find so excellent a collection of works in, pardon me for saying it, so unexpected a place." "Books are my only companions," said Major Molineux, and as he spoke he scanned the table a little nervously, as though to see which of the volumes had attracted my attention. Determined to penetrate the secret which I was now convinced existed, I pressed my advantage. "I see that you study the higher mathematics. This calculation on the variation of parameters is not made by a schoolboy, while here," and I lifted from the table a sheet of paper, "is something headed, 'Probability that an event observed several times in succession depends upon a cause which facilitates its reproduction,' in which the calculation is made by finding the equation of the logarithmic curve." Major Molineux changed colour, and took the paper from my hands. "I did not know that I had left the records of my folly thus carelessly exposed," said he. "The fact is that I have always been a lover of anything which approaches an exact science, and the calculation of probabilities is a fascinating subject. I am foolishly fond of it." And as he spoke he tore the paper into pieces and flung them into the basket at his feet. "Some men say that mathematicians are mad," I said. "If this be so, you have the antidote as well as the bane, for seldom have I seen, even in the libraries of my professional brethren, so fine a collection of works on mental disease as that which I examined last night. I had gone too far for his patience. "Dr. Fair," said he, "you are my guest, and my house is at your disposal so long as the illness of my friend's daughter compels you to remain in it. But let me remind you that an old man who lives by choice, a recluse, may have sought such seclusion in order that he might be spared these very comments upon his private tastes, which you have just been pleased to make." And bowing stiffly, he left the room. Chapter 5. He did not appear that day, nor at breakfast the next morning. I felt that I deserved the reproach which his absence conveyed, and was angry with myself for having so far permitted my curiosity to outrun my discretion. But the more I reflected upon the circumstances of the case, the more convinced did I become that Castle Stuart held within its walls some mystery of mind or body, upon the like of which it was not given to man to frequently look. And despite the Major's rebuff and my own self-consciousness, I resolved not to abandon my quest. In pursuance of this resolution, I sauntered out into the garden the next afternoon, thinking to fall in with the old servant. I was not disappointed. I found him standing in a little glade or opening in the brushwood, staring with all his might at the upper windows of the house. "What interests you?" I cried, taking a guinea from my pocket. "Can you not spare time for a little friendly chat?" He looked nervously about him, pocketed the gold piece, and pointing to a coarse patch of verdure at his feet, whispered, "It was here he did it." "Did what?" I asked. "Cut his throat," said the old man. "And they buried him here, with a stake through his heart. But that can't hold him." "What do you mean, man?" I asked, experiencing a fresh access of horror at this hideous and unexpected story. "Who is buried here?" "Savary, the forger. Him as found his wife gone as well as his liberty. This was where he saw them walking. The captain was a handsome man, and Mrs. Savary had been a beauty, they say. She died mad for all that." And he laughed, the discordant laugh of one whose experience of life has been of the sort to make him rejoice in others' woe. "What was the captain's name?" "Tremaine. He was the Major's brother-in-law. He's dead too, and Savary will soon see them all out." "Does his ghost walk then?" I asked, attempting a laugh. But the day was cloudy, and a cold wind seemed on a sudden to chill me. "Ask Mrs. Rochford. She saw him last night. Listen, 2 years ago I was sitting up with the old hag in the kitchen when I heard the doorbell. It was blowing a storm like it was last night, and the wind went shrieking round the house as if it wanted to get in and tear us. It was the Major's Thursday, and I daren't go near him for my soul. I crept to the door, thinking some traveller had got out of his track, for no one who knew us would come to Castle Stuart. But before I could open it, there was an awful screech, and something went whirling round the house like a pack of dogs. I heard them bellowing and grunting at the back and ran upstairs to look. I looked out of that window," he pointed to the room where Mrs. Rochford had slept the night before, "and I saw something like a herd of huge swine on Savary's grave, rooting and snarling and slavering in it, and then I slammed to the window, for some awful thing with a white face was there trying to save itself from those hellish beasts. The noise continued for 5 or 6 minutes, and then the sky cleared, like it did last night, and I saw no more." "You have a cheerful imagination, my friend," said I. "But pray do you couple this delectable story with your master's day of seclusion?" Once more the ugly look came into his face. "Nay, I know nothing of that, and it's no business of yours either, though you are a doctor. Doctors cannot cure Major Molineux's complaint." "Then you think that he is ill?" "Not I. He's well enough." "Look ye, Bagley," I said, determined to try a last chance. "You're too sensible a man to believe this nonsense about ghosts and suicides and hunted souls. I am a doctor. I shall be here some days. I may be able to do your master good. Tell me," and I exhibited another guinea, What is the mystery in connection with Major Molineux? He is possessed by a devil, said Baggerly, and then, as if he had said too much, made for the house with grotesque, uneven strides, and left me standing on the coarse grass that sprung from the dishonoured grave where the suicide lay with a stake through his heart. A voice roused me from my reverie. Major Molineux himself was at my side. "Fair," said he, "I have overheard the last words of your conversation. I do not expect you to pay attention to the vulgar fancies of an ignorant hind. The story of the wretched being who lies buried at your feet is neither part of my history, nor does it concern my family. The romance which was sought to be woven around his name and that of my dear sister's husband has been long ago proved false, and it was perhaps the gratification of a desire to preserve from derision the last resting place of a man more sinned against than sinning, which caused the report to first obtain circulation. When my niece came to live with me, I caused the fence which formerly surrounded Arthur Savory's grave to be removed, and unless some chattering imbecile like old Baggerly had informed her of the story, this portion of the park possessed for her no more interest than any other. The fantasies of women are innumerable. He spoke rapidly and with some heat. It was quite evident that he expected a reply, and a direct one. "No one, Major Molineux," said I, "is less superstitious than myself. But I have seen so much of what is termed superstition resolve itself into fact, that I am not prepared to pronounce any fantasy of the imagination as wholly baseless. But before we proceed further, let me feel sure of my ground. I came here only in my character as a physician in attendance upon a patient who has been made unavoidably your guest. I find myself face to face with an extraordinary enigma, yourself, your peculiar studies, your secluded life, above all your strange disappearance from all society on one day in the week, have combined to raise in me a curiosity which I cannot stifle. What is the mystery which darkens your life?" Major Molineux planted himself firmly on his feet and took both my hands in his own. His face was deadly pale, and he seemed to be nerving himself for a great effort. "Do not turn from me, do not shun me," he said. "Had it not been for your persistence, I had never spoken. Baggerly is right. One day in each week I am possessed by a devil." "Come, come," said I, a little shaken despite my self-control, as the powerful old man searched my eyes with his. "There are many sorts of devils, devils of wrath and devils of discontent, and we are all now and then at the mercy of such." "Aye," said Major Molineux, "but to be possessed, as I am, by—no, I cannot speak it. I could not repeat, nor could you listen to the tale. Forget what I have said, and—" he pressed my arm with painful violence. "Swear to mention to no living soul that which I have unguardedly betrayed." "A physician's lips are sealed without an oath," said I. "You may rely on me. And now I must see Miss Rochford. Let us go in." He regained his self-possession before we reached the house, and not during the day was the subject again mentioned between us. I thought it better for the development of the case to permit my patient, for so I now considered him, to begin a confidence which I feared might be withdrawn if I pressed him too closely. Seeing that I touched only on indifferent matters, he presided at dinner with his customary composure, and entertained us all with stores of a mind acquisitive of information and fastidious in the imparting of it. "The old gentleman was never more amusing," said Rochford, as I parted from him in the hall. "When we move Beatrice, I'll ask him to come to Ashmead. The change would do him good." "Ask him by all means," said I, "and I will second your entreaties. If we can once break the chain of recurring events in his life, we may give him another lease of it. Our intrusion, unwelcome though it was at first, has already roused him into something like gaiety. Miss Rochford should be well enough in a fortnight to be moved, for her case looks in every way favourable." "How can I ever repay you for your kindness?" said Rochford. I knew a method by which he could repay me 1,000-fold. but I did not think it wise to mention it at that moment. Alas, events soon occurred which rendered it impossible for me to ever ask that favour which I prized so highly. On Wednesday afternoon, Major Molineux begged to see me alone. He led the way to his library, carefully closed the door, and after much prelude began to talk about his malady. "I wish to ask you," said he, "if it is possible for a man to be mad and know that he is mad." "There are different kinds of madness," said I, feeling that I must speak with caution. "An insane man may have lucid intervals during which he reviews acts done during the period of his insanity and condemns them. A man may have an uncontrollable impulse to commit a certain act, as to jump out of a window, for instance, and yet be quite conscious of the folly and even wickedness of his morbid promptings. I knew a case in India of a soldier who was seized with just such a morbid desire. He felt compelled to murder someone very near and dear to him, and at last deserted in order to do it. Arrived in the town where the intended victim lived, he absolutely had himself tied up by the people of the inn until the proper authorities could be sent for to secure him. Some months afterwards, the object of his morbid lust for blood died, and the man at once recovered. He described his sufferings while resisting his impulse as terrible. Surely no devil worse than this could possess a man, and yet he could hardly be called mad. "You give me a few grains of comfort," said Major Molineux, "though I have no such fearful impulse as that which you describe. Every week, from 10 o'clock on Wednesday night until 10 o'clock on Friday morning, I am the prey to the most bestial and awful delusion which it has entered into the mind of man to conceive. I know that the fault is in my own brain, and that I am but the dupe of imagination. But where that fault lies I have sought in vain to find. Science brings me no solace, and though my sense laughs at my imagination, I dare not confront the hideous thing which my imagination has created to mock my sense." "You are not alone in your misfortune, dear sir," said I. "There have been many men haunted by phantoms who have lived to make them but a source of amusement. The operation of ghost-seeing is simple enough. We recall a landscape which we have seen, we will it to return, and it is instantly present. That is to say that we project from us that which we wish to recall, and look at it, and listen to it, as if it were again external to us. An artist draws a dead face from memory, while a musician plays an air forgotten by his hearers. The same effort, too, of will, which recalled the lineaments of a corpse and the notes of the opera, could people a house with ghosts and fill the darkness with the voices of the dead." "Ah," said the Major with a sigh, "mine is no such illusion as those which you have mentioned. No voices of angel or of demon speak to me. No faces grotesque or enchanting present themselves to my gaze. My delusion, and delusion it is, though sometimes I am half persuaded of its truth, is so horrible, so damning, so fearful in its naked insistence of the beast in our fallen natures, that I have been tempted not once but 100 times to set my spirit free from the soul-destroying bands which enwrap it." He spoke with sober vehemence and appalling earnestness. That this feeling is part of the delusion, I know, but that does not make it more bearable. For 9 years I have endured a weekly agony, compared with which the keenest torments of man's devising are as naught. In body and in soul I have suffered more than tongue can tell. Save that my reason did not desert me, I should have speedily qualified myself for a place beside the poor wretch over whose grave I confessed my secret. And yet I ask you, can I lay claim to the possession of reason when I am the sport of an imagining so foul as that which torments me? But, said I, gently, you have not told me the nature of this delusion. I dare not, said Major Molineux. You would quit the house. To no human ear can I speak the history of my unspeakable degradation. He rose suddenly. Tomorrow is Thursday, he said. Come into my room tonight and see what I dare not speak. And he left me. Miss Rochford had regained consciousness, and I hoped that the next few days would see her in a fair way of recovery. Mrs. Rochford had laughed off her fears, and attributed, as I did, the visitant's face to a more mortal source than that of the wandering soul of a suicide. Rochford was in high spirits at the approaching departure, and even Mrs. Pennethorne seemed less terrified than usual. I could not have had a more propitious hour for the investigation of the mystery which had baffled me, and I waited with much anxiety for midnight, which, being about the time I had seen Bagley on the previous week, was, I thought, a customary hour with the Major for taking his oddly timed meal. I was not amiss in my calculation. As the timepiece in the hall rang out the hour, the old convict appeared with the tray. "Your master has desired me to see him," I said, "and I will go up with you." "As you please," said Bagley, roughly, "but take care." He led the way along the great corridor until he came to a double door. "If he is not waiting on the other side," said he, "you'll be lucky." And opening a slide in the panel, he pushed in the tray with its burthen, bolting the panel quickly. I stood, uncertain how to act. Bagley turned to descend the stairs. "Will you not go in?" I asked. "Not for all the money in Hobart," said the man, his very hair bristling. "Listen." I bent my ear to the door and could distinguish the confused sounds of voices. "Who is with him?" I asked. But the old servitor had left me. I was alone, and from the other side of the oak panel came a sound which caused my blood to curdle in my veins. In another instant I should have fled. "Molineux? Major Molineux!" I cried and rapped at the panel. The door shot back and I entered. The passage was pitch dark, but in the distance I could see a lighted candle in what appeared to be a bedroom. I advanced towards it. The door shut behind me, and I felt someone place what seemed to be a hand on my shoulder. Major Molineux was right. Words refused to lend themselves to the depiction of that which the horror-fixed eye saw in that lonely chamber. Chapter 6. Mrs. Rochford was the only person whom I met at the breakfast table the morning after my visit to Major Molineux's room. The Major himself, for reasons which I could readily appreciate, desired to postpone, as long as possible, an interview with one who had become possessed of his unhappy secret, and Rochford had intimated his intention of arriving later in the day. Now that his daughter was out of danger, there was really no real reason for his presence, which indeed was a daily element of disturbance in the sick room. "When do you think that Beatrice can be moved?" asked Mrs. Rochford. "I long to have her at home again under my own roof, for though Major Molineux is most kind and attentive, I experience a sense of depression in this house which I cannot shake off." "I quite agree with you that the sooner Miss Rochford is got home the better," I replied, "though the feeling of which you speak is attributable only to your own anxiety, and perhaps in some measure to the unwonted quietude of Castle Stuart after the bustle of Ashmead. Nevertheless, we must be cautious. I never like to disturb a case of fracture, however slight, for at least 20 days, and we have been here but barely 7. "True," she said, "this is Friday. I had forgotten," and her glance at the vacant place at the foot of the table noted to me the circumstance which had escaped her memory. Some slight confusion in my manner must have betrayed me, for with a woman's quickness she said suddenly, "Dr. Fair, you look worn and ill this morning. Tell me, do you know anything about this mystery of Major Molineux?" "My dear madam," I said, "I am a doctor, and I cannot speak even indirectly of matters which have come to my knowledge in the exercise of my profession. Major Molineux has been complimentary enough to ask my advice upon certain points connected with his health, but I am as yet but very partially informed as to his case." "Nay," said she, "I did not mean to put an impertinent query, but it has occurred to me that in return for the Major's kindness to my daughter, Beatrice might, by and by, rouse him from his melancholy, and even win his confidence as to the secret cause of his malady. If you have ever chanced, when in conversation, to hear a phrase innocently uttered, which conveys to your private ear a world of esoteric meaning, you will comprehend the quick pang I felt at this sudden approximation of two ideas. Beatrice and my patient of last night, that pure girl and the most unhappy being, whose hideous hallucination made him doubtful of his humanity. When a student in Paris, I had seen the body of a beautiful girl exposed on a dissecting table for some needful demonstrations in anatomy. The sight shocked me then, and as obedient to the law of association, the picture of that nerveless figure, so passive under the searching knife and exploring eye, rose again before me. I almost saw the pallid features shape themselves into a likeness of those of Beatrice. "Do not think of such a thing, madam," I cried. "It is quite impossible. Miss Beatrice must never know aught of the—" and I stopped abruptly. Was I not already committing myself? Poor Mrs. Rochford quite failed to appreciate my fervour, but I was glad to see that she attributed it more to zeal for her daughter's welfare than to any serious illness affecting Major Molineux. "I had no intention, of course," she said, "of urging the project now, but by and by, when change of air and scene might be tried on both." "Let us defer the consideration until then," I said, and with some difficulty succeeded in retaining my composure sufficiently to sit out the untasted meal. Left to myself, I began to reflect. Upon what a hideous thing had I stumbled. Far from being, as I had suspected, the melancholic craze of a hypochondriac who might believe himself a teapot or a wash-hand basin, Tiberius Caesar or Alexander the Great, the hallucination of Major Molineux was one which blended itself so inextricably with the affairs of his daily life that he could no more escape from it than he could stay his pulse at will. Bound as I was by the most solemn pledges of personal and professional honour, I had taken upon myself the burden of a frightful secret which I must lock forever in my own heart, or share, and sicken in the sharing, with the unhappy man whose choking breast was its only other repository. And having acquired the knowledge of this polluting horror, I must bear it with me for ever. For did my skill haply succeed in removing from my companion's mind his belief in the absolute entity of it, still the image of it was there stamped upon the brain, and ready to start into grisly life again at any instant. Nor was it possible to fix the idea in words. Even now, after 30 years, I can recall the agony of mind with which, pacing in the deserted park by the lonely grave of the suicide, I strove to bring the abstract horror of the thing into some shape, that I might grapple with it and defy it. In vain. It eluded my mental grasp as a jellyfish slips through the fingers. Formless and void, it yet was there, a foul and filthy thought, profaning the shrine of sense. And he, the wretched man, in whose brain cells this more than chimeric growth of shame and horror had been fed and fostered, what was my suffering to his? I saw clearly the line which separated the delusion of the one day from the comparative sanity of the other 6. I could trace, far down in the beginnings of mental being, the first growth of the appalling thought which now mounted reason's throne and shook the sceptre of judgment. I was no believer in the damning mystery. Mine was, after all, but the experience of one who, meeting a leper uncovered in the byway, has to wash in many waters ere he can return to forget that loathsome sight among men of sound flesh and healthy limb. But the leper, poor ruin, knowing his own bitter fate, cut off forever from the intimacy of the honest, put away from the sight of the noble, the very manhood which, supporting him in his trial, urges him to retain what semblance to his fellow men the cankering corruption may have left him, and make an exit from life, while he is yet a step removed from rabid putrescence. What far-reaching depths of anguish and of shame has not his soul plumbed in the swift descent of its despair? One thing was certain. Having thus possessed myself of the knowledge of Major Molineux's terrible story, I was bound by every tie of honour and humanity to alleviate his sufferings. Such of my brethren who are read in the literature of insanity will understand me when I say that I shuddered at the task. I am not what the world terms a religious man, and in those days I was perhaps less so than the experience of a long life has taught me since to be. But in reviewing the case of this unfortunate gentleman, I found myself involuntarily offering up a petition to a higher power on his behalf. I had, during the long vigil of the dread night, mastered all physical symptoms, and arrived at the conclusion that, though science might palliate the tortures of the sufferer, she could not restore him whole and in his right mind. I am possessed by a devil, the poor man had said to me, and I did not profess to have the power of exorcism. Still much might be done. The relief to his burdened mind must be already great, and if I could but prevail on him to discuss the theme, and my flesh crept with disgust as the thought thrilled my nerves, in calmness, haply some break in the continuity of the hallucination would be discovered, whereby I could prevent the recurrence of the phenomena, or at least destroy the regularity of their appearance. The trial, distasteful as it was, should be made, and I sought the house to give directions to Bagley to send to Hobart for some drugs, with which I had resolved to begin the treatment. I found the old servant in something of an anxious mood. He was evidently desirous of knowing how I had sped with his master, and I thought it a good opportunity to ascertain how much or how little he himself had learned. "I had a long conversation with Major Molineux last night, Bagley," said I, "and I have every hope that I may do him some good. Pray, when did you first observe the symptoms of his illness?" "I've lived with him for 17 years," said the convict, with something approaching to tenderness in his voice, "and for the first 8 years he was the same as the rest of us. Then he began to keep to the house and avoid company, then to his room, and so by degrees to what you know him." "Have you ever seen him during one of his attacks?" I asked. "Never, thank God, but I have seen them as have, God help 'em." "Whom do you mean?" "Miss Agnes. She saw him, and she never held up her head after. 'Twas one of them windy nights, like the one I was telling you about. When the screeching began, it seems that Miss Agnes got frightened and ran out, calling for her uncle. The old woman there slept next to Miss Agnes, and she says she heard the Major's door open, and him come out to her. Then Miss Agnes cried out upon God to save her, and when Pennethorne got to her, she was lying fainted in the passage. She was took with shivering that night, crying out on names we didn't know for someone to help her. The doctor was old Murchison, said 'twas a cold she took in running out from her warm bed to the passage. We knew better, Pennethorne and I. 'Twas fright she died of." "I am afraid that Mrs. Pennethorne is as much a romancer as you are," said I, with a most unsuccessful attempt at a smile. Dr. Murchison was, no doubt, quite correct in his diagnosis. "However, I want you to go into the town for these matters," and I handed him the paper. "The Major has consented to submit to my treatment, but you know how sensitive he is, and I trust to your discretion to make no remarks either to him personally or to others." "You needn't fear," returned he, unhitching the bridle from its peg. "I've lived too long here not to know how to hold my tongue." He hobbled to the door, and then came quickly back with awkward gesture meant to indicate self-possession. "Cure him," he said, and thrust something into my hand. It was one of the guineas I had given him over the suicide's grave. Pondering over the confirmation of my worst fears, which the manner of the death of poor Miss Tremaine gave me, I resolved to see if I could obtain any information from Dame Pennethorne. The kitchen was a large one, and amply furnished with necessary utensils of all sorts. Our visit had compelled an almost entire change in the domestic policy of the household, and evidences of plenty and even luxury abounded. A fat-faced wench, employed in assisting a boy scullion to scour a huge fish-kettle destined to contain our Friday fare, directed me to a door which led into a sort of still room or housekeeper's closet, the private apartments of the woman to whom Miss Rochford had taken so strong a dislike. Mrs. Pennethorne was seated before the empty grate, staring with all her dazed might into the fuel-less fireplace. She did not hear me approach, and coming close behind her, I tapped her lightly on the shoulder. The effect was curious. She did not start nor scream. She simply trembled violently, turning, as she did so, her head slowly round, until her glassy eyes, round and unspeculative as those of a fish, met mine. Her toothless mouth, open in the curve of expectation, seemed not unlike that of a cod. Had I taken her hand, I should have almost expected to find it cold. Slowly her senses undazzled, and she recognized me. "I was thinking of you, sir," she mumbled, her wrinkled cheeks flapping together like bellows. "But I daren't speak to you." "Why not? What mystery can you have to conceal?" She looked round her again with that frightened air of which I have before spoken, and then suddenly clutching my arm, with all her choppy fingers distended like the claws of a bird, she whispered to me, "Take her away, doctor. For God's sake, take her away." "You mean Miss Rochford?" said I. "Now listen, Mrs. Pennethorne, I want you to tell me what you know of Miss Tremain's death. It took place in that very room, did it not? Answer me." She stared wildly, gaping and goggling after her unpleasant manner. From the adjacent kitchen came the laughter of the scullion and the cookmaid. "Come, Mrs. Pennethorne," I repeated, "recollect yourself. What took place before Miss Tremain's death?" "She met him," said the old woman, nodding at the wall nearest the house. "I know nothing more, but there is a curse upon this house which brings agony and woe to all who live in it." I looked at the crone with aroused curiosity. Was my conjecture right? And was she too a victim to some form of mental aberration? It was likely enough. There is contagion in insanity, and it might be that the lonely life led by a woman of her age, whose constant employment was speculation upon a mystery in another's life, had rendered her also a monomaniac. I felt a sudden repulsion to the house and its belongings. The old woman had no coherent tale to tell, and if she had, the atmosphere seemed hot with the breath of madmen. I paid a hurried visit to Beatrice, saddled my horse myself, and galloped into the town. I felt that I must have a few hours of commonplace life, or I too might become the sport of those unseen agencies which take up their abodes in pampered bodies and neglected minds. Chapter 7. Soothed and sustained by a night's rest in the unromantic precincts of the club, I returned to Castle Stuart with all the cobwebs swept out of my brain, and with a positive professional delight at the prospect of the cure of Major Molineux. I found my poor friend anxiously awaiting my arrival, and so soon as lunch was disposed of, he drew me aside. "I've felt an inexpressible relief," he said, "since I revealed to you my fearful trouble, and something like hope begins to light up the darkness within." "That is a good symptom," said I, "and now we will have a little physical history to follow upon the mental one." I asked him a series of questions upon his general health, and found, as I expected, that he had been for years a stranger to anything like regularity of life. He ate when he pleased and what he fancied, walked but little, and would often sit for a day together without moving from the table where he pursued his physiological studies. He was emaciated in body, but of late, and as his malady had progressed, he had become more and more addicted to the use of large quantities of animal food, with which he drank weak brandy and water. "I find," said he, "that I grow less and less able to eat vegetables or bread without experiencing serious inconvenience, not merely as regards indigestion, but as concerns the extent and pressure of that which I know to be a delusion of the brain." "Of course," I replied, with the wisdom which doctors affect when they are at fault for a diagnosis. "The normal condition of things in the body is changed when certain substances are taken into it. And in certain other conditions of it, moreover, there are produced within it organic products which affect the organs of the senses and interfere with their functions. Indian hemp, opium, and 1,000 other substances have the power to set to sleep some senses and open others. While, and this I suspect is at the bottom of your sorrows, some abnormal condition of things which has set you astray as to your relations to things without. Then you think, cried the poor man, almost joyfully, that I am not necessarily diseased in brain. Necessarily? No. The body of a man is a mere bundle of organs for condensing external facts, as says a writer with whom I hope by and by to make you acquainted. The man has a hearing organ, a seeing organ, and so on. In each organ there is a receiving nervous surface. From this surface, leading into the man, is a communicating nervous cord, while at the end of this cord is a nervous center, which takes up the impression conveyed and makes it part of the individual's experience. And mischief may be present anywhere and in any of these parts. Exactly. But to lay the finger of science on the particular part is often impossible. The surface, the cord, or the centre may be to blame, and we thus pass at a bound from the merest physical investigation into a psychological speculation of the most intricate and uncertain nature. Major Molineux cast a wistful glance at Val Helmont and the rest. But is it not possible for science to reason with something like certainty in such matters? The universe is governed by fixed laws. Fixed laws rule the bodily and mental health of man. I have 20 times calculated the chances of the periodical return of my malady. An astronomer can as accurately calculate the return of a passing world. Anatomy has laid open to us all the secrets of the human machine. Is there none, then, who can penetrate into this poor body and pluck forth the heart of its mystery? He spoke with eagerness, but without passion, and as I saw him there and recalled his awful doom, I felt my heart throb with a pity which swallowed up once and forever all other feelings. Dear Major Molineux, dear friend, I said, science cannot do what you ask. See, here, and I drew down a chart of the nervous system, which was affixed in its box to the wall. Here are the nerves which emanate from the brain, and which are under the control of the will. Here are the ganglionic nerves, which are not under the control of the will. See how all the great vital organs depend upon these last for the performance of their functions. And these ganglionic organs tell us nothing. The heart beats, the lungs breathe, the stomach digests, but we take no note of their motions. It is only when these organs are diseased that we become conscious of their existence. A reflex action now begins. Sense on soul and soul on sense, discussing, arguing, disputing. The body is slowly informed of the capacities of the mind. The mind gradually takes upon itself the functions of the body. See here, these myriads of glands, each working under the influence of the nerves distributed to them. Each filament, each follicle participates in the general disorder, and a chain of morbid association between mental and corporeal organs binds mind to body, a chain the woven links of which are intertwisted beyond human skill to loose. You ask me to show you the heart of your mystery, as well as ask me to show you thought made visible. And yet these men, said the Major, glancing at his shelves, more than half believed that among the many forces of great nature was one, supreme, eternal, which in its varying shape was health, air, gold, love, jealousy, and death. Others beside your mystics, said I, have recognized such a force, but they have given it a name. So far as man is concerned, there are in him two distinct manifestations of this force, the will and the intellect. Will is instinctive and unwearied. Intellect is reflective and fatigable. But the intellect is as a bridle to the will, and sometimes it happens that will takes the bit in its teeth and runs away. Then takes place something like that of which you complain, and the mere instinctive and animal part of the man assumes sole control of his personality. Is this madness? If the deliberative faculties cannot regain the mastery over the executive faculties? Yes. No, said Major Molineux. If such a force exists, madness and sanity are but terms. We are all parts of one great whole, and discord is impossible. Nay, that which seems discord may be harmony, and my awful sufferings a necessary part of the universal joy. Yet why should I bear this burden? I am not a wicked man. Heaven is my witness that I have lived uprightly according to my lights. Why am I singled out from all my fellow men to be the subject of so fearful an outrage? If my body has sinned, let it be punished. But why make sport of my intellect, and leave godlike reason at the mercy of the basest part of man? He walked up and down as he spoke, and I watched him with increased interest. He had evidently thrown off the mask, and was speaking in his real character. The genial militaire, the entertaining host, the learned mathematician, the well-read physiologist. These were mere characters assumed by him as garments of disguise. The real man was before me, no longer calm, courteous, and self-restrained, but fevered with suffering and wild with undefined anxiety. This man, interested in the speculations of Holland or Van Holst, the discoveries of Laplace, and the philosophy of Newton. The wide world held for him but one subject, the maddening speculation on his own madness. "We've talked long enough this evening," said I, "and Rochford will be here to bid us goodbye directly. Calm yourself, and receive him with your wonted ease." He grasped my hand convulsively, and after a few moments' silence, resumed in a less high-strung tone, "I will be calm, Doctor. I always try to be so. But is it not terrible, this fight between a strong will and a flagging intellect? And each mysteriously helps the other, for I feel that if for an instant I relax my determination to be sane, at that instant I shall become a raging madman. Did we live in olden times, one would say that an angel and a devil were fighting for my soul." He fell back on the sofa with a faint laugh, and at the same moment Rochford entered hurriedly. "Major," he said, "forgive me for disturbing your chat, but Beatrice has given signs of consciousness." The young girl's name recalled us both to present surroundings. "Go to her at once, fair," said Major Molineux. "I am tired and shall seek rest. Remember the house is as your own, Rochford, and do not scruple to use it." "When did it happen?" I asked, as we ascended the stairs. "About 10 minutes since. Her mother was watching her, when suddenly the child opened her eyes and said, 'Agnes!' The name of Miss Tremaine. I confess you somewhat surprised me. I should have expected that any remark she might have made would have been in reference to the accident. I wonder if she regained consciousness earlier and unknown to you." "I was asleep," said Mrs. Rochford, "nearly all last night, and I certainly fancied when I awoke that Beatrice had slightly changed her position, but there was no other sign of increased vitality, and I dismissed the matter from my mind." I raised Miss Rochford on her pillows and took her hand. The fingers closed on mine, and a faint smile passed over her lips. "You are right," I said. "She is conscious. The greatest care is now required. No noise, no conversation, above all, no sudden excitement. This is the most critical period in a case like hers." I remained for some time in the apartment, and persuaded Rochford to stop the night. We passed an agreeable tete-a-tete, and on the next day had the satisfaction to find that the invalid was growing steadily convalescent. In the afternoon, Major Molineux made his appearance. He was in unusually good spirits, and told me that he had felt better than he had done for many a day. "Whether it is your medicine or your society, Doctor, which has so benefited me, I don't know, but I feel a new man." We expressed our congratulation, and the Major surprised us both by stating that he had determined to visit the village of Green Ponds, where he had an estate. "Do you know," said he, "that I have been going through my banker's book and looking up some land valuations, and I find that I am worth more than £90,000. And what do you intend to do with it? Asked Rochford, lighting his cigar. Some fortunate relative in England, I suppose. By no means, said Major Molineux. I have left it to your daughter. There could be, of course, no further discussion after so startling a statement, and I hastened to change the subject by suggesting that a sojourn of 2 or 3 days at Green Ponds would assist the cure which had been so happily begun. You have lived too long here, I said. This house is gloomy, and you know every tree and shrub by heart. There is nothing like change of scene. Each object brings with it new associations and opens up new trains of thought. Take my advice. I will, said Major Molineux, cheerily. I feel benefited already by the mere thoughts of the journey. May I see Miss Beatrice before I go? Rochford looked at me for a reply. I had rather that she had not been disturbed, but after the magnificent avowal of the legacy, it would seem churlish to have refused. You may, but for a moment only, I said. You will forgive me, but it is important that her newly recovered intelligence should be allowed healthy sleep after its enforced fainting fit. Together we mounted to the room. Beatrice was breathing regularly, and her eyes were closed in peaceful slumber. Poor girl, said Major Molineux. She was a great favourite with my little Agnes, and leaning over the bed, he touched the forehead of the sleeper with his lips. An astonishing and to me unaccountable change took place in the features and conduct of the invalid. Her face flushed crimson red. She opened her eyes, and raising herself to a sitting posture, stared wildly about her. At sight of Major Molineux, she fell back as though life had suddenly left her. Some ugly dream, perhaps, has disturbed her, said I, and the touch of your lips brought about the imagined catastrophe. She will soon recover. In effect, so soon as Rochford and our host had withdrawn from the room, Beatrice revived. Tears rolled from beneath her eyelids, and she feebly sought for my hand, holding it fast in hers, as though clinging to some saving stay. I was wrong to have admitted him, I said to Mrs. Rochford. I should have remembered that your daughter had always a dislike to him. Low as were the tones in which I spoke, Beatrice must have heard and understood them, for she increased the pressure of her slender fingers on mine. He visits Green Ponds today, I continued, and at my persuasion will stay a day or two there, so that he is not likely to alarm us again, however foolish we may be. As I concluded my sentence, Beatrice released my hand with a sigh of relief. That sigh betokened much that was unpleasant to my self-love. From the moment when I had seen her life in danger, I had confessed to myself that I had loved her. It is true that I was almost old enough to be her father, but love is a passion which takes no thought of years, and my affection had sensibly increased with my prolonged attendance on her. I had saved her life, and it would seem as if that life belonged to me, and I might hope in the future to bend it to my will. The glance of her eyes, the smile on her lip, the pressure of her hand, seemed, I thought, to indicate that she, in her inmost heart, owned a feeling for me warmer than friendship. But the instant relaxation of the muscles at the mention of the Major's absence showed me that she had besought my attention merely to shield her against some threatened danger. Her unreasoning dislike to Major Molineux had returned at the sight of him, and she wanted me near her only because she imagined that I would prevent a repetition of his visit. Nevertheless, I did not despair of winning her, and taking my hat, went in search of Rochford. He knew my position and my prospects. The island in which he lived, lovely though its climate and scenery might be, was not a place where he would be likely to meet with a better match than myself for his daughter, despite the difference in our ages. Captain Rochford was not rich. He had often told me that his income never amounted to more than £700 a year. And I suddenly stopped. I had forgotten the statement made by Major Molineux concerning the disposition of his fortune. Beatrice Rochford, with £90,000 dowry, might choose even in London, among men of rank and estate. It was impossible, moreover, that I should, after hearing the promise concerning the legacy, go to the father of the heiress and ask for her hand. I should appear a mercenary adventurer whose unblushing conduct was dictated by the meanest motives. The position was embarrassing. Now that I clearly perceived that Beatrice Rochford was beyond my reach, my love for her grew more intense. I could put away the thought of her so long as I knew that she was near me, and that there was at least a possibility of my being able to win her for closer companionship. But now I realized that I must think of her no more. I began to suffer the pangs of sudden remorseful jealousy. Why had I not spoken earlier? Why had I not at least allowed Rochford to have guessed at my feelings? And this misfortune had come upon me by the act of the man upon whose behalf I had assumed a responsibility that darkened my waking hours, and bid fair to cause me profound mental disturbance. What could have induced Major Molineux to become generous so abruptly? Angry with myself and circumstances, I resolved to put an end to this state of suspense. I would return at once to India, and in the meantime would see Beatrice as little as possible. Rochford, I said after dinner, I have received letters from Calcutta, which I have too long neglected. I must return forthwith. You are sudden in your determination, said Rochford, with a slightly wounded air. I should have mentioned it before, but the precarious condition of Miss Rochford forbade my inflicting on you any inconvenience. She has now recovered consciousness, and with careful nursing needs small medical attendance. Well, said Rochford, we shall all be sorry to lose you, Beatrice especially, I know. But a man of talent cannot be expected to spend his days in an out-of-the-way nook like this. It was on the tip of my tongue to say that I should ask nothing better than such a fate under certain conditions. But I thought of the £90,000 and was silent. The next day I went to Hobart to make preparations for departure, and found that it would be impossible for me to leave for at least 3 weeks. I resolved, however, that I would not spend that time in the society of the Rochfords, but make one of a fishing party to the southwest coast of the island. I was prevented from going by the following circumstance, which I simply record here without any speculation as to how it came about or what induced it. On Thursday evening, the second day after I had left Castle Stuart, I was playing a rubber of whist in the card room of the club, when I felt someone touch me on the left shoulder. I turned round and saw no one. Somewhat puzzled, I commenced to deal, when I heard a sharp sound, as if produced by the swish of a descending whip, and the cards were, so it seemed, struck from my hands. I raised my eyes, and over my partner's head I saw the face of Beatrice Rochford, floating as though in air. The lips were almost blue, and the wildly sweeping hair framed a face of waxen pallor. The eyes, those wonderful eyes into which I had so often gazed, were alone alive, and they were fixed on me with an expression of imploring agony. Muttering some incoherent excuse, I hurried from the table, ordered out my horse, and galloped down the road to New Norfolk. I had no doubt whatever then, and I have none now. I have already said that I do not intend to speculate upon the peculiarity of the case, that I was summoned to witness a catastrophe of some kind. I was not prepared for what awaited me at Castle Stuart. The house was lit in the whole of the upper front, and there were lights moving about the lower rooms. Rochford himself took my horse. I had some instinct that you would come. Go upstairs. I went straight to Beatrice's room and found her dead. But death in its mercy usually leaves for the last look of the sorrowing survivors composed features and restful eyelids. Miss Rochford's body was rigid, her hands were clenched and her eyes wide open, while that once lovely face was deformed with an expression of such supernatural horror that I could not glance at it again. How did this happen? Said I to the mumbling and shivering Pennethorne, who had been set by Rochford on guard at the door, with strict orders not to let the bereaved mother see the fearful sight within. Why didn't you take her away? She said, mopping and mowing in her usual fashion. I told you what would happen. She has seen him. My blood ran cold. as the Major returned. He returned last night and kept his room all day as usual. We left Miss Rochford for a few minutes, and when we came back she was like you saw her, and this was on the table. She gave me an unopened letter, addressed to myself, in Major Molineux's handwriting. Without waiting to inspect its contents, I crossed the corridor and made my way direct to the Major's bedroom. He was lying on his face on the floor, dead, and standing on the table was an empty 2-ounce vial and an empty wineglass. Hastily I tore open the letter. It was written in a firm, bold hand, and evidently intended to be read by other eyes than mine. It was, in fact, Major Molineux's last effort to keep from the world's knowledge the fact that his mental life had in it anything to conceal. Castle Stuart, 24th November 1835. My dear Dr. Fair, my mind is so unhinged by long suffering that I have at length determined on committing suicide. I have left the whole of my property, save some small legacies, to Miss Beatrice Rochford. Turner and Thompson have the will, and I have written to them to come to Castle Stuart so soon as my letter is received. Keep my keys in your possession until their arrival, and then deliver them to my effects. They will settle all my accounts. I wish you health and happiness. I am, yours truly, J. Molineux. Chapter 8. An inquest was held the following day, and I stated as much of the foregoing history as I thought desirable. It was clear that, if a verdict of felo de se was returned, the will would be set aside, and the immense fortune forfeited to the Crown. I repeated in brief the account of the late Major's malady, saying that he was subject to a delusion of a nature which I could not reveal, which seized him on every Thursday, and that during that time I did not consider him responsible for his actions. The whole city was aware of his peculiar conduct in secluding himself on that day, and the jury returned, by direction, a verdict of temporary insanity. 27 hours after death, an examination was held by the doctor of the regiment, a resident surgeon, and myself, the result of which I carefully preserved. The emaciation was considerable. The deceased having fallen on his face, there were marks of contusion on his left temple. The body exhaled an odour of prussic acid. The eye did not present any particular appearance. The stomach was remarkably capacious, and the contents were set aside for analysis. In some parts of the mucous membrane of this organ, especially near the upper and inferior orifices, there were marks of recent inflammation, particularly in stellated patches, where slight marks of extravasation were visible. In several portions of the small intestines, the external hue was dark, almost approaching to livid, and the mucous membrane of these portions was vividly or darkly red, but without extravasation or perceptible injection of the vessels. The large intestines exhibited no marks of disease of any kind, and the liver, spleen, mesentery, kidneys, and abdominal viscera were all perfectly sound. Before a knife was laid on the body, I expressed a wish that the ganglionic centres might be carefully examined, as I conceived that perhaps some irritation of the nerves of organic life played an important part in the phenomena exhibited by the patient. The solar plexus was therefore minutely investigated, but nothing abnormal was perceptible. In the thorax, there was great and varied disease. The lungs were studded with tubercles, especially the superior lobes, and extensive adhesions existed between the pleurocostals and the pleuropulmonales. None of the tubercles had broken down, so as to discharge their contents through the bronchial tubes. The heart was not larger than usual, but the pericardium was universally adherent. The organ itself presented one of the finest specimens of simple hypertrophy which I have ever seen. The pariettes of the left ventricle were 1.25 inches in thickness, and the cavity was with difficulty discovered. It could not have contained 4 drachmas of blood, if so much scarcely a third of that which a healthy left ventricle would be capable of throwing off at each contraction. There was nothing abnormal in the arteries, and the blood in every part of the body was perfectly fluid. The brain was large and remarkably firm, the vessels rather congested, but there was no visible trace of disease in the head. The skull was of unusual thickness and density. And now comes the most remarkable part of the pathology. Upon the pneumogastric or vagus nerve of the left side, just before the recurrent is given off, There was a hard, jagged body, the size of a kidney bean, composed of calcareous matter, and probably a diseased bronchial gland converted into this substance. The union of the nerve and the ragged mass was so intimate that no dissection, without cutting the nerve or the calcareous matter itself, could separate them. The foreign body had, in fact, penetrated, or at least invaded, the nerve, which was thickened at this part. Lower down and involving the cardiac, pulmonic, and esophageal plexuses in a labyrinth of perplexity were several diseased bronchial glands, rendering the dissection a tedious and difficult operation. When we consider that the vagus nerve rises in the medulla oblongata and is distributed chiefly to the great organs not under our control, and that it communicates with almost all the ganglionic nerves, we can form some idea of the disturbance produced in the system by a jagged calcareous mass implanted, as it were, in one of the most important nerves of the great vital viscera. It will be noticed that the majority of the organs to which the pneumogastric nerve distributes its functions were found changed in structure or disordered in function. The state of the heart probably accounted for the great emaciation, combined with the incessant craving for animal food, while the fact that it could not circulate more than 1/3 the usual quantity of blood through the lungs must have produced deficient sanguification in the pulmonary apparatus, whatever was the amount of digestion. Diseases of the heart are very apt to affect the brain, and my colleagues and myself agreed. The dissection showed that the mental functions were disturbed by physical changes, and that the monomania in this instance, as probably in many others, was dependent on corporeal rather than moral causes. I followed to the grave the remains of the lovely girl I had once thought to make my wife, and a few weeks afterwards quitted Hobart Town, and I never revisited it. The mystery of Major Molineux has now been told, at least as much as can be told without violating a confidence which I even now hold sacred. There are many points in this strange and dreadful history which I cannot attempt to explain. The periodicity of the attack is one of these. The exact relation which the injury to the nervous system bore to the peculiarly horrible form which the delusion assumed is another. The par vagum and the agents of communication between the mind and matter of man, between his soul and his body, and their derangement would affect both spirit and flesh. How? I cannot say. Nor dare I speculate on the dread question why Providence permitted a poor wretch to endure tortures incomparable even among the torments of the heathen's fabled hell, and that without a particle of moral guilt.